On an early November morning in 1913, ships were moving across the Great Lakes under ordinary autumn skies. Within hours, the weather began to change. By the time the storm ended 4 days later, dozens of ships had been destroyed, hundreds of sailors had been lost, and the lakes had witnessed one of the worst maritime disasters in their history. Sailors would later give it a name, the White Hurricane. In the early 20th century, the Great Lakes formed one of the busiest shipping routes in North America. Iron ore, coal, grain, and lumber moved across the lakes in large cargo vessels that connected the industrial cities of the Midwest with ports along the Atlantic. To those who lived far away, the Great Lakes might have sounded small compared to the oceans, but standing on their shores told a different story. Lake Superior alone stretches more than 300 miles from west to east. In many places, the opposite shore cannot be seen at all. When strong winds rise, the open water can produce waves as large as those found on the sea. Storms moving across the continent often gathered strength over the lakes, drawing energy from the vast cold water below. Sailors knew that autumn was the most dangerous season. By November, cold air sweeping down from Canada could collide with warmer air rising from the south. When those systems met above the lakes, powerful storms could form quickly and spread across hundreds of miles of water. Ships caught in the middle of those storms sometimes had nowhere to go. In early November of 1913, dozens of cargo vessels were already moving across the lakes as the shipping season slowly approached its end. Among them were ships like the Henry B. Smith, carrying iron ore across Lake Superior, and the Charles S. Price, moving coal through the lower lakes. For the crews aboard those vessels, the weather at the start of November looked ordinary. But across the region, conditions were already beginning to change. During the first days of November in 1913, the weather across the Great Lakes region began to shift. Cold air was moving south from Canada, while a separate storm system formed over the central United States. As the systems approached one another, the pressure across the lakes began to fall. By November 7th, strong winds were already pushing across Lake Superior and Lake Michigan. Cargo ships continued their journeys, but captains began reporting rougher water and falling temperatures. Storm warnings were posted at several ports, though in those years the forecasting systems were still limited. Ships already underway often received little information beyond what they could observe themselves. Through the night, the winds continued to strengthen. Snow began falling across parts of the upper lakes, carried sideways by the growing gusts. By November 9th, the two storm systems had merged over the Great Lakes. The pressure dropped rapidly. Winds rose to hurricane force. Across Lakes Superior, Huron, Erie, and Michigan, waves began building to enormous heights as the storm swept across hundreds of miles of open water. Ships caught on the lakes suddenly found themselves in conditions far worse than anyone had expected. For some crews, the storm would become a battle that lasted hours. For others, it would become something far more final. As the storm strengthened across the lakes, ships already underway struggled to hold their course through the growing waves. On Lake Superior, one of those vessels was the Henry B. Smith. The steel freighter had left the port of Marquette, Michigan, carrying a cargo of iron ore. Heavy weather was already moving across the lake as the ship departed, but cargo vessels often continued their journeys through rough conditions late in the season. Shortly after leaving port, the Henry B. Smith turned out into the open water of Lake Superior. It was the last confirmed sighting of the ship. As the storm intensified, snow and wind swept across the lake, reducing visibility and driving waves higher with each passing hour. Farther south, on Lake Huron, another cargo ship was fighting the same storm. The Charles S. Price, a large freighter carrying coal, had been traveling through the lower lakes as the weather worsened. By the time the storm reached its peak, winds across the lakes were reaching hurricane force. Blinding snow swept across the water, and enormous waves crashed against the hulls of ships trying to maintain control in the storm. Some captains attempted to turn toward shelter along the shoreline. Others continued forward, hoping to outrun the worst of the weather. For many ships, the storm proved too powerful. When the winds finally began to ease days later, ships across the Great Lakes had vanished. One of them was the Henry B. Smith, which never arrived at its destination. Another was the Charles S. Price, whose fate would not be discovered until days later. When search vessels finally found the freighter drifting on Lake Huron, the ship had been overturned by the storm. Its hull floated upside down on the cold gray water. When the storm finally began to weaken, the Great Lakes were left strangely quiet. For 4 days, hurricane-force winds and heavy snow had swept across the water, driving enormous waves against ships scattered across hundreds of miles of open lake. As the weather cleared, shipping companies and port authorities began waiting for vessels that should have arrived. Some ships eventually limped into harbor, their decks damaged and their crews exhausted. Others did not appear at all. Along the shores of the lakes, pieces of wreckage began washing ashore. Wooden lifeboats, fragments of cargo, broken sections of ship hulls carried by the waves. Search vessels were sent out across the water. Days later, one of the missing freighters was discovered drifting on Lake Huron. It was the Charles S. Price. The ship had been overturned by the storm and floated upside down on the gray surface of the lake. No survivors were found. On Lake Superior, the Henry B. Smith never appeared again. Despite searches along the shoreline and across the lake, no confirmed trace of the vessel was discovered at the time. Across the Great Lakes, more ships were reported lost. Freighters vanished. Smaller vessels disappeared in the storm. As reports slowly arrived from ports across the region, the scale of the disaster became clearer. By the time the final numbers were known, the storm had destroyed or wrecked more than a dozen large ships and damaged many more. More than 250 sailors had lost their lives. It would become the deadliest natural disaster in the history of Great Lakes shipping. In the days after the storm, ships that had survived slowly returned to their routes across the lakes, but many never did. Freighters like the Charles S. Price and the Henry B. Smith became part of the long list of vessels claimed by the storm. For the families of the sailors who had been aboard those ships, the disaster left behind only fragments of information. A final sighting, a drifting hull, or sometimes nothing at all. In the years that followed, meteorologists studied the weather patterns that had formed over the Great Lakes during those November days in 1913. The storm had developed as two powerful systems collided above the region, creating a rare and violent combination of blizzard conditions and hurricane force winds. Sailors would eventually give it a name: the White Hurricane. At the time, weather forecasting across the lakes was still limited. Storm warnings traveled slowly, and ships already on the water often had little information beyond the sky above them and the waves rising around their hulls. By the time the full strength of the storm became clear, many vessels were already far from shore. Today, the Great Lakes still stretch across the continent, much as they did a century ago. Vast inland seas where the far shore often disappears beyond the horizon. Storms still cross the water. Winds still rise in autumn as cold air moves down from the north. And beneath the surface of the lakes, the wrecks of ships lost in storms like the one in 1913 still rest on the lakebed. Silent reminders of the days when the water turned violent and the storm swept across the lakes. That was tonight's story. You've been listening to The Midnight Box. Wherever you are, thank you for listening. Good night.